going to ask Dave to come up and join me. We're going to do something a little different this morning. Ellen's in the front row. Dave's in the back, Mike's in the back. Mike, did you want to come up here and sit so you can have more proximity? Nope. You think about it. This morning is informed for us largely due to what we've learned from you. And what we've learned over the years is through the prayer requests and through the text line and through multiple conversations is that mental health is an issue. Dave is a psychologist. He works at Southeast Psych. And if you've had an opportunity to listen to Journey on My Mind, he's my cohort with Sam. Again, not here. He used to be. And now Lauren King has joined that, and she's also a psychologist at Southeast Psych. Where we want to take this morning is to introduce this idea. It's a little different, we know, but we want to talk about it openly. We want to bring this to just a normal conversation. We are going to take questions in about a half an hour, so if you have questions, you can text us. The mics will go around the room. You'll be able to ask us. That part of this is pretty normal for us now, is that we ask questions and we try to respond. We don't necessarily have answers, but we respond. And I also want you to know that part of us wanting to do this is a need to be able to speak to many of the things that you're dealing with, either as an individual, a family, or even as you encounter church. Because there's a lot that I know many of you wrestle with, and we know that because of a lot of anonymous things that come to us, and also non-anonymous things. But this started a while ago where Dave and I did a couple of podcasts on addiction. And so this is kind of us trying to invite you into the conversation, and we would like you to ask us questions. Dave, if you could just introduce yourself a little bit so that they get an idea of who you are.
Great. Well, the banner headline is, I've been married to Ellen for 32 years. Let's give it up.
Ellen.
Most of you here have not had the experience of Ellen in the audience, so just be prepared that
She usually comes to 11 o'clock.
I may be low-key heckled during this. But we have 4.5 kids. There's one we don't care very much for, so that's another story we'll talk about. And we have been in Nashville for about 7 years. We raised our family in Charlotte, North Carolina, and loved it. And I've been a psychologist for the entire time we've been married. So I've also been a psychologist for 32 years. And it is one of those jobs that when people talk about how much they either hate their job or they're just trying to get through their job, I love my job. I love it. It is a privilege to do it. It's an honor to do it. And every day is like I look forward to doing it. So that's my background. I've also been a Christian since I was a wee lad.
Yes.
And I was one of those kids that made a profession of faith in Vacation Bible School, when, of course, you know all of it when you're 7 years old.
7 years old,
right?
Yeah.
It was a really great flannel graph presentation.
Oh.
By the way, this week, my brother, who's fostering his great-niece and great-nephew, called me and said that his great-nephew came back from Vacation Bible School and said, Uncle Brian, I accepted Jesus, and now I am a Christian and a Savior. And he says he's got some stuff to work out. But I was kind of the same way, right? So I grew up in the church, and I remember at 14, later, having a little more clarity about what it meant.
That's good.
And then since then, involved in youth group in high school, campus ministry in college, volunteer staff for campus ministry, local church. I've been involved in teaching a seminary adjunct. Yep. So I've been immersed in Christian culture my whole life. And so having this kind of marriage of psychology and faith has been really where I've been soaking my head for almost my whole life.
Soaking your head. We'll leave that right where there. So would you say that you, just a point of clarity for the, Are you a Christian counselor?
No.
What are you?
I'm a psychologist who is a Christian.
Okay.
And that sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but it's not, because usually when people say they're a Christian counselor, they're saying, I have a biblical counseling model, and hopefully today we'll talk about some of the distinctions, but I am a psychologist who is also a Christian.
There you go. Okay. Well, it seems like culturally, we look around and it seems like mental health is becoming a bigger deal.
Yeah.
It's becoming more prevalent.
Yeah.
Is that a true statement, or is that just because it's becoming just more talked about?
It's both, but it is a true statement.
Okay.
So what we know is that about 1 in 5 people have some kind of mental health issue that would, whether they seek treatment or not, would be up for treatment, would be deserving of some kind of counseling or therapy. That's a lot of people, 1 in 5. Look at this survey. This was a survey of pastors. And if you could put up the slide, this is of pastors. 23% of pastors in this study said that they have personally struggled with some kind of mental health crisis. So it's right around the same average as the general population.
Okay.
And so even people in full-time ministry, this is a struggle that they're now acknowledging. But here's the real big headline, and this is part of what's driving this, is the next slide is, of the younger generation, we're calling Gen Z, of that generation, 42% have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. That is a huge number.
That's a
We're
lot.
talking about
That's almost
double-digit
half.
increases
Yeah.
in the last decade.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of reasons for that, and we could get into more of the reasons, but it's not one thing.
Right.
It's multiple reasons, but it includes exposure to social media, especially the visual social medias that help, where kids are comparing themselves to others, where they're getting weird messages, where they are getting bullied and so on.
Yeah.
It's that. It is the culture that we're living in that is so divisive, and all the negative things are getting we're getting bombarded with. Mm-hmm. It's also, though, on the positive side, the awareness is greater and the stigma is decreasing, particularly among that generation.
Right.
And so there's a greater willingness to talk about it, to acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that whether it's just acknowledgement or there are plenty of reasons why we think that the increases are big, and they're big particularly in the last decade.
Okay. So with that in mind, obviously there's an influx of people looking for help.
Yeah.
That's partly what's prompted this.
Right.
But the other thing that over the years, I've been a pastor for 30 plus years, and with that I've seen this almost as an adversarial relationship with the church, with Christians who are counselors, as opposed to Christian counseling, but psychology, particularly when it comes to therapy, particularly when it comes to addressing those things. Why do you think that is? Because I think probably everybody in the room, if they've been in a part of the church for a long time, have experienced some kind of uneasiness or conflict or even hostility towards psychological approaches.
Absolutely. I said on the podcast, somehow when I was growing up, I missed that memo.
Yeah, well.
And so I was just like, hey, psychology sounds great.
Yeah.
And then I get into it and I realize that there is this way of seeing psychology. A few years ago when we lived in Charlotte, one of my neighbors asked me to have lunch with him. I didn't know him that well, but he went to my church and we would talk about music and things like that. And so I didn't think much of it. And we sat down at lunch and he said, so you consider yourself to be a Christian, which you always know it's going to go bad when it's you consider. Right. And
Let me reconsider.
Right, I said, yes. And he goes, and you're a psychologist. And I said, yes. He says, how do you reconcile those things?
That's
and so
right.
I gave him an answer.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't buy that because Christianity, the Christian faith, and psychology are at odds with each other. They are opposed to each other.
Right.
They are different worldviews that hold different values. So neither of us left that meeting satisfied. It was not a happy meeting. And by the way, he said, I've already sent you a book that will explain all this to you. And he did. But
it was Mike Geary's books, wasn't it?
Was one of Mike. Right. Very anti-psychology, Mike Geary. He's still back there. And since then, I've really become increasingly aware of the division. And look at some of these quotes. This is, I'll just hit you some, these are just a few, but they're from different decades of the past few decades. The psychology is compared to a garbage dump that Christians go to. It's compared to or said to be a tool of Satan. It's deeply anti-Christian. It destroys individuals and families and communities. Go to the next one. Look at this. It continues that the root of all conflicts isn't psychological, it's all spiritual. That the theories in psychology, they inflict grave spiritual damage on people. And that the field of psychology has grown up at the same time that the number of psychological problems in our society has increased. So the implication is you guys are causing this problem.
Right, rather than part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
Right, it's like we have more cancer doctors because the increases in cancer. We don't blame cancer doctors for causing cancer.
Well, maybe some people do. But
Maybe they do.
Yeah.
But the idea is that in the church, particularly in certain sectors and veins of the church, that psychology and Christian faith are incompatible. And the latest movement of this, which just blows my mind, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would this ever be a thing in the church? I can't imagine it. It's this movement to say that empathy is not only a sin, but a grave sin.
Yes.
And so there
Which
was
is crazy,
an
isn't it?
article that came out, and it was written like a screw tape letter piece, and it was really talking about how Satan is using empathy as a way of gaining a foothold and a way of leading Christians astray. And rather than people going, that's insane, there are a number of people that are like, sounds like a good idea. Now, I'm not saying that's the majority of Christians or majority of people of faith, but it had a little traction, which really speaks to what we're up against and what we're trying to speak against.
Yeah.
About a decade ago, I was invited to speak at a church that was pastored by a man named Derwin Gray. Some of you are familiar with him. He's an African-American man, used to be in the NFL, is one of the best leaders and preachers and writers that I know. And he was saying our church is going to be committed to this idea that we're going to actively talk about mental health issues and embrace people seeking help and treatment. That was especially important because in the Christian community, he knew what he was up against. In the African American community, he knows what he's up against.
Yeah.
And so that was about a decade ago.
That was a while ago, yeah.
And what I would like to see is exactly what we're doing now, is increasingly more traction around having these kinds of conversations.
Yeah. So the 91% slide, yeah, it speaks to is stigmatized, and 91% of the Christians would say that mental health is, if you are diagnosed with some kind of mental health, it attaches some stigma to you. What does that mean?
Yeah, think about that. 9 out of 10 people in the church say that their experience in the church, whether or not they personally have struggled with a mental health issue, is that this is not something we talk about.
Right.
This is not something that we are open to. That is a huge number, and that's exactly why, at the same time issues of mental health are increasing, we're also still having these conversations about whether it's okay to have these conversations and whether or not issues of therapy and psychology are incompatible with faith.
Right. So I know this isn't in our notes, but part of what triggers in my, one of the things that prompted me to seek some help was going through COVID, and I hit some depression, I hit some things.
Yes.
And with that, has there been a correlation between some of the recent events like COVID, like some of the other recent events, that has either revealed what was already there or prompted more in this arena of mental health?
There's no question that COVID was a big part of that spike,
Okay.
and particularly among the younger generation. There
Yeah,
are
I
kids
bet.
that are isolated, they're at home, they're no longer with their peers, they're increasingly more depressed and anxious. and we're still seeing the effects of that. In the same way that we're still seeing the effects of them being behind academically, and those studies are now coming out increasingly, like we've really got a generation of kids that have gaps of 1 and 2 years behind. We're also seeing now real strong evidence that COVID was devastating from a mental health standpoint.
Yeah.
And at the same time, COVID was in a larger context culturally where there was much more division, there was much more anger, there was much more a sense that we are not unified. And so that is just a cauldron that just creates all the stuff that we're seeing.
That's a good word, cauldron.
Yeah.
I like that.
Add on top of that what we've already talked about, which is the social media. So you're isolated.
Yep.
You're in a divided culture, and then you're seeing all this stuff on social media that just feeds it. So yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay. So how do we ultimately, you're making a case for the mind and mental health, and it's not all spiritual. There's some spiritual component there.
Right.
And yet, how do we make the argument that psychological problems aren't all spiritual problems?
Yeah, I think that's
the question.
That's the central question.
Right.
That's what we've got to answer, is because that's really what it comes down to, is are all problems that are of an emotional or relational or psychological nature spiritual ultimately? And then is the solution ultimately a purely spiritual solution? And what I'm going to argue is no, that they're not purely spiritual. So first, again, I know we're throwing a lot of numbers at you to start with, but I think they're important. A third of Americans, not just Christians, not just people who are people of faith, but a third of Americans believe that mental illness can be overcome with prayer and with Bible study and spiritual disciplines like that. So that it's in the ether, it's in the culture,
right,
that whatever we're calling mental health is really ultimately a spiritual issue that can be overcome with spiritual solutions purely.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to push back on that and say, here's the argument, or at least a beginning part of the argument for why that's not true. And I'm going to start with talking about your brain. And this is important because we're going to connect this to why this is a broader conversation. So your brain is this immensely powerful thing. And I'm going to make this analogy.
Computer.
If you think about your brain and your mind as being an analogy to a computer hardware and software, then the computer would be hardware, the operating system and the applications are the software. Your brain is hardware, and then the thoughts and the patterns are the software. And so it's a fairly good analogy of how we can think about our brain and our mind. Well, look at the next slide. The brain is this immensely complicated, immensely beautiful thing, and 2% of your whole body mass is made up of your brain, and it takes up 20% of all your body's energy. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So there's tons of electrical activity, tons of chemical reactions that are going on in your brain all the time. Your brain has an estimated 86 billion neurons. And each of those neurons, which are nerve cells, that at the end have different connections, make connections kind of like the internet. This connects to this one, this connects to that one. And this is an estimate, of course.
Billion, right?
No.
Billion. You said, is it billion or million?
86 billion. Did I say million?
I don't know.
86 billion neurons.
A lot.
A lot. And of those connections, there are about 125 trillion interconnections.
Oof.
So think about how complicated that is just from the start. And different areas of your brain do different things. Some of them have to do with memory. Some of them have to do with emotions. Some of them have to do with planning and so on. And if you want to get a scope of how powerful your brain is just from a memory standpoint, again, we used to think in terms of your brain's capacity that it was endless, and then we thought about it being very limited.
Yeah.
The best guess that we have, and again, the estimates change, but they actually tend to go up we underestimate it.
Sure.
Memory storage for your brain, the capacity is about 2.5 million gigabytes if you want to be practical about that, it could hold about 3 million hours of television. And oof, that's all sitting up here in a couple of pounds of your brain, right?
That's a lot.
Now, here's why this is super duper important, is your brain is by far the most complicated organ in your body, obviously. And just in the same way that things can go wrong with any organ, your pancreas, your lungs, your stomach, things can go wrong with your brain. And depending on the ways in which they can go wrong, might show up in a variety of ways. Anything from having memory problems, to having problems with emotional regulation, to problems with you name it.
Yeah.
And so there is this part that we have to acknowledge, first of all, that it can't all be spiritual problems if the brain is involved, if the hardware sometimes is compromised or is affected.
Yeah.
And so
it'd be more of a physical problem at that point.
it would be considered more of a physical problem. But I want to broaden it out a little bit more.
All right.
So there are different ways of thinking about, let's just use depression. That's not the only mental health thing we're talking about, but that's the most common, depression and anxiety, the most common.
Yeah.
Okay. So here are a couple of definitions of depression. And these are simplistic, but let's say that we'll use the spiritual definition. Spiritual definition is that depression is this form of hopelessness that happens when you don't trust God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. How about the biological definition, what we were just talking about? Depression is a biologically caused condition, the hardware of your brain. Does that make sense? Sure. What about situational definition? The depression is an emotional collapse that comes from being overcome by hardship, trials, tribulations, grief, and so on.
Yep.
That also makes sense. And then maybe the intrinsic or internal definition that it's due to a person feeling worthless or having low self-esteem. What I would tell you is that there are bits of each of those that could be true, but usually it's not just one thing. Usually it's all mixed in together, and it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And for different people, it is of different proportions.
Right.
So some people, their depression is almost purely biochemical.
Right. So that would be a hardware?
A hardware issue. And other people, that might be not as much of an issue.
Right.
So the way I tend to think about it is, this is a made-up number, but let's say you need 10 points to be depressed.
Okay.
First, let me use another health example just to make the point.
Okay.
Let's say you need 10 points to have high blood pressure. Okay? And they could come from the side of genetics and biology or the side of circumstance and environment. So is it possible that you could have high blood pressure because you're in bad shape, because you have a high-stress job, because you lay around on the couch and eat
now you're just
unhealthy
getting
food?
personal,
right?
aren't you? Yeah.
And no, you're.
And you listen to people's problems.
And you listen to people's problems all day.
Yeah, look at us. Now I'm depressed.
I mean, is that possible that all those things might conspire to cause you to be depressed, to have high blood pressure? Yeah. Well, is it possible that every person in your family has high blood pressure, and no matter what your diagnosis, you have high blood pressure? Yeah. Right? You know people like that. You might be people like that. And is it possible that it could be a little bit of this and a little bit of that? Mm-hmm. That's more likely. And so you might be 5 and 5, or 3 and 7, or 2 and 8, and so on. You get the idea. Same thing's true with depression. You might have, depression might be, by and large, a biochemical issue, because you have this long family history of depression, by the way, diagnosed or not. Right? So often in my work, I'll have people come in who will be clearly depressed, and I'll say, is there anyone else in your family that has been depressed? And they'll say, no one. And then the more they talk, it's very clear that lots of people in their family have been depressed. So there might be this biological piece, this family thread that you see, and then there also might be circumstantial pieces, and usually it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Right. What I would submit is that can't be, due to that, this can't be purely understood as always a pure spiritual issue. Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, that helps. So how do you integrate these things, psychology and Christian faith? How do you
Yeah.
Because that's really the question, because I think sometimes we want to exclude one for the other.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's this or this. Kind of like the quotes we started with is like, these two things are worlds apart.
Right.
And you have to pick a camp and you can't be in one.
Right.
And this is what I would suggest to you is there is a few ways to marry these things that have integrity. And so I'll give you 3 models, and this didn't come up from my head. This is something that is in the literature, in the ways of thinking about this. A lot of good Christian thinkers who are thinking about this. One, I changed the title,
words. Oh, okay.
but what it really means is apples and oranges.
Yeah.
One is the apples and oranges approach, which is that the spiritual and the psychological are really talking about different domains of life, different things. So there might be some overlap, but really the psychological and the way that we just talked about how your brain works and about the patterns that you've laid down, is not necessarily the same thing as the spiritual, and that it's okay for both of those domains or realms to exist. There's another model that's called the biblical counseling approach, and this is why I don't call myself a biblical counselor or Christian counselor per se, and that is that the idea is the Bible is the authority that we start with,
Right.
and that is the authority that we use to derive a model for how we interface with people and their problems.
Right.
And that is the authority that trumps all others, which I'm not necessarily saying, as you'll see in the last one, necessarily disagreeing with, but that psychology is always sort of subordinate to that. And so it starts with kind of a biblical model. We're deriving principles from Scripture,
Right.
and then we're assembling a model that helps us when someone comes in and they're depressed or they're anxious or they're having relationship problems.
Right.
The model that I tend to, and I'm not saying you need to see it the way I do, but the model that I tend to subscribe to is what we call an integration model. And at the end of the day, it says that all truth is God's truth. If something is true, it is true. And so you can get truth from Scripture about the nature of humans, the nature of the human heart, about human relationships.
Right.
But you can also derive truth from psychological research and clinical practice. And that because these things are true, they're not necessarily incompatible, and you can use these things in an integrated way. I think for me, that's the way that I tend to approach my work,
Right.
is that I feel like everything that I do is informed by my relationship with God and my faith, but that I'm clearly pulling things from psychological research. I don't believe that the Bible is this guidebook or textbook for all of therapy or all of counseling.
Yeah.
There are models that come out of psychological research about how you treat trauma and how you treat depression, how you treat anxiety and OCD and so on, that you could spend your whole life looking at the Scripture and it's not there. It's not that it's hidden from you. It's just not derived from there.
Yeah.
But yet it's not incompatible with it.
Right.
And so that's kind of the model that I use and take
Right.
with this.
Okay. We are sitting at 10 o'clock. I'm gonna give them the opportunity to ask us questions. If they don't, we can continue with our material. But I wanted to make sure that they had a chance to at least, in this arena of understanding the integration of faith with psychology, we want to answer questions. If you have a question about anything other than John 3:16, feel free to, Sam, you got a mic. You can text in a question if you want. The line is there. So if anybody has a question at this point,
Please go for it.
Hi. Also, I just want to say, thank you for talking about this, because I feel like it's kind of a new thing that's, really polarized, so I, appreciate that we get to talk about it. But one thing I was thinking about is, my journey with mental health and that struggle, and I just want to know, your opinion on therapies, because what I have found was that the therapy that I went through and a lot of my friends go through is very self-worshiping and very, away from God. And so I guess, how do you balance that in therapy with someone who's not a believer? Or do you believe in, still drawing from the Bible in that therapy?
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic question. I really do. And there is the temptation, I think, in some therapy approaches and with some practitioners to increasingly sort of pull people into themselves and do navel-gazing and really make it self-focused, but it doesn't have to be that. And so good therapy, in my view, ultimately, it's an opportunity for someone to work on the thing that might hold them back from being all that they can be to others and to the world, right? It's sort of unleashing them to be doing their thing on behalf of other people. And so that's how I tend to see it. But again, just like any profession, there's a range of not only how good someone is, but also what kind of models that they use. I would say two things. One is that it's okay to seek out someone who's coming from a primarily Christian point of view. That's fine. But there are some instances where you want the best person for that particular issue. If you've experienced a massive trauma and your choice is a Christian counselor who doesn't know much about trauma, but is a good Christian counselor, and someone who's a trauma specialist, most of the time I would advise you to take that person, even if they're not a Christian. Same thing with if you've got some really wicked OCD, you want someone who knows what they're doing within that. Now, that being said, your point is excellent, which is if therapy's doing its thing, it's not just drawing you into yourself and making you self-centered and self-focused. It's really saying, let's get this issue resolved in a way that pushes you out to other people, connects you more in your relationship with God and with others. So I think it's an extraordinarily good question.
Well, we got one online here, which I think is a great question because there's probably a lot of people wondering this in the room. How do you determine if and when you should be seeing a therapist? Should that be a regular practice or seasonal?
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. I'll go.
Okay.
I'm thinking seasonal, like, okay, fit it into the budget.
Right. Yeah, look at the QuickBooks first. Right. The first part of the answer is that, first of all, there's sort of a joke that the whole world would be better in therapy, and that may or may not be true. But
depends upon the therapist.
Right, it depends upon the therapist. But I would say this, that if you are struggling in a way that's significantly interfering with your functioning in your life, in your primary roles in your life, as a parent, as a partner, as a boss or coworker, if it is significantly interfering with your primary roles and your functioning and your well-being, then, and you've tried other things, then I think it's worth considering. I'm not here, like I don't mean this in any bad way, I'm not here for any of you to come see me, right?
You got enough to do?
I got plenty. Yeah, it's not, and there's so much need out there that's the thing with therapists is that the demand is huge. But what I would say is when it gets to the point where it's interfering with your functioning, then you've sought out other kinds of counsel or other kinds of readings or practices, and you're just getting dogged by it.
Yeah.
What surprises me still is that there are some, particularly men, I tend to see young adult age guys, that have been struggling with just crippling anxiety or depression and don't even know how to name it.
Right.
And so even if you can't name it, even if you don't know what the word is, if you know that it is significantly interfering with your functioning, then do it. Now, the second part of the question I can answer a little more succinctly, which is there are some conditions that it should just be seasonal, hit and run. So let's say you're having panic attacks and you've done all these things for panic attacks. You probably could go see a therapist for 4 times or 5 times and be good to go. Even though it seems like it will never get better and it's debilitating, there's a path forward with that that's fairly short, usually.
Yeah.
But you also may have other conditions that are just chronic in nature, and sometimes you need the therapy to be not only to provide skills and tools, but also sort of be part of your support system.
Yeah, I was going to say support.
So the answer is, and it's not a wimpy answer, it's the truth, is it
yes
depends.
And yes.
It depends on
Yes.
the nature of the struggle.
Yeah, and part of the reason we have Sam on staff, Sam, over there, the bass player, is he helps with that. He helps people sort out that question. What are they wrestling with? He's kind of a, can I call you a triage man, who people will sit and talk with, and he'll go, you know what, this is beyond me. I'm going to refer you to someone, or you help them, right? Okay.
Yes.
And that's
yes. That is
Sam.
yes.
So.
And that speaks to the church's commitment to this.
Yes, we're very committed to it.
Right, and so Sam's a great resource. And if you're not sure, talk with Sam, and then he can sit with you and say, I think we can meet, or we can have a plan, and that will be sufficient. Or other times he may say, look, if it were me, I would seek out this kind of help or support.
For sure.
And again, I know we've said this, but that's really the message that we're saying, is that part's okay. Right?
Yeah.
Seeking out the help and support when you need it is not only compatible with faith, but it is a good thing.
Yeah. You have Sam?
We got one over here.
Hey, so one, my heart is beating out of my chest right now. I'm an introvert, and I don't know what I'm doing.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for talking. Yeah.
I guess my question is a little bit of, how do you know the difference as a believer of what spiritual warfare is and what an actual mental brain chemistry makeup is when you're maybe, I don't know, if someone was like having an anxiety attack or something along those lines, just spitballing here, if that was somebody that I knew.
Like you are right now?
Yeah, like I don't know, to somebody.
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically, talking in front of a group of people.
And we've actually had a few of those questions online too, so I think
Right.
that's a great question.
Right, and we're not discounting the spiritual, and we're not saying that all things are purely understood psychologically. I would say, thank you again, great question.
Yes.
I would encourage you to not feel like you've got to be the one to sort that out on your own, to not feel like you're the one that has to sit there in your own head and understand what part is what. And so to be able to sit with Sam or a trusted mentor or therapist and talk it through. Another piece of that, though, is sometimes if you look at your own history and your family history and you're like, there is this thread of anxiety in the family. And whether it's diagnosed or not, we see this. That's going to lean you more in the direction of this is probably a psychological thing or a biochemical thing, or at least in part. And so I don't want to sort of discount the fact that there are spiritual realms and that there are things that we struggle with on a spiritual plane and level. But I also think those kinds of ways of seeing it I often see people who have spiritualized psychological problems for years and even decades and have suffered needlessly. And what that does is the focus is all about blame and self-blame and shame and guilt and this heaviness, and that's not of God. And so I would just encourage you to seek out someone who's an objective voice in your life.
I just to add something underneath that is when if you do saying stuff out loud like you just did, like living in isolation fosters it to continue. And so even if it's a trusted friend, it's someone to say it out loud to. Sometimes when I say stuff out loud, I realize, whoa, I've been thinking that, and thinking it in my brain sounded right. And then I say it out loud, and somebody goes, that's not right. And so it gives an opportunity, right, wrong, that's not what I mean, but just you're not thinking correctly. So to stay in isolation is the best case, is the worst case scenario.
Thank you.
My bad.
Yeah.
Thus
hold for editing.
Yeah. You can edit that right out of there. Because what ends up happening is the isolation will ultimately reinforce the bad thinking. Okay.
We got. Oh,
Well,
go ahead, Sam.
hey, we got people.
I got a text question after you.
Okay.
Hello. Sorry, I've got a New Zealand accent, so I talk funny.
Don't ever
apologize for a
that.
New Zealand accent.
My question is around how, as a psychologist, you reconcile the so the locus of control, internal locus of control, external locus of control. if people have more of an external locus of control, they're going to probably feel more existential, like more anxiety, more cortisol production, right? But do you think there's such a thing as a God-centered locus of control? Mm-hmm. Where do you think it's possible that in the Christian faith we have this ability to delegate mm-hmm. the things that we cannot fix and cannot control, cannot take agency over, to God, and therefore less cortisol production happens, less anxiety. Because I feel like when it's just like external look at the world around me and me, I feel like it's if the weight of the world is just on us and there is no God, to me that it creates such a huge sense of terror because we don't control the world around us. So, how does that work?
Man, great question. I mean, seriously.
Didn't we do a
brilliant
podcast
question.
on
Let's
this?
applaud this question here. That is fantastic. It really is. So the concept that he's referring to, locus, which sounds like a bug, but it means locus or center of control. And some people have a center of control, which is I feel like the decisions I make control my life, control the outcomes. And then there's an external locus of control, which is I'm just sort of adrift in the world where things are about luck and chance and external factors and randomness. Yep. And what the research points to is that the more internal a person's locus of control is, the healthier they tend to be in terms of taking actions and owning their life and moving forward. And what your question is to kind of push against that and to say, if you're going to be this purely, have this pure locus, internal locus of control, then isn't that terrifying to kind of like, I have to make everything work myself and God's sort of out of the equation? Is that a decent summary? Right.
A submission to, like,
right.
Putting God into, there's a God locus, like mm-hmm. Delegating that, God is in control somewhat, right. Then we're in free will determinism.
Sovereignty of God thing.
Right. So is there a way of thinking of locus of control being a God-centric or God-centered locus of control? I would say yes, but here's the concept I would throw out here, is there is a psychological idea called dialectical thinking, right? And dialectical thinking is the ability to hold two things that are in tension with each other at once. And sometimes in faith traditions, in our faith tradition, we have a hard time with that. We tend to get very, very polarized, and that's really where some of the early quotes that I gave are like, it's got to be this or this. It's like, it's either psychology or it's God, and it can't, we're not anywhere in between. Yep. And the integration model is really a dialectical way of thinking about, could we take truth here and here and integrate them? The same thing's true, I think, with locus of control is, yes, it is better for you to say, I'm going to, I have some agency in my life, I can make decisions that are good for me. And at the same point, have a fundamental trust in God that allows you to be centered on Him in terms of where control ultimately lies. So I would say it's a beautiful question in that way, and it's healthy for us to be able to not only say, I have agency that I need to step into, but yet God is ultimately sovereign, in control, and He is a good God for us. So, excellent. Thank you.
We're going to take one more, and I just want to encourage you, if we didn't get to you or you have other questions, we're getting a bunch of them on the text line. This will inform us how to go forward with Journey on My Mind. Journey on My Mind is the podcast that we do on this topic, but also we will respond to them. One way or another, either Dave or I, if I can't figure it out, I'll send it to him. But we will respond.
Text question for both of you guys. I'm going to try and not be distracted by Mike, so I'm going to move this way.
That's impossible. Just accept it.
In the Bible, it talks about when Jesus would encounter people who seemed to have mental health issues, and he cast out a demon in them. How do you know if it's a demon or just biological/environmental circumstances? Also, could a biological mental health issue be due to our broken, sinful world? I feel like therapy or working through mental health isn't shown in the Bible, but if it is, I would love to know what it says about it.
Right. So that's a whole podcast. So let's do a.
That is a
I'm not
whole,
kidding.
yeah.
I have a few thoughts, but
Okay,
it
and
really
I have a
is,
couple thoughts
to
after
do
you.
it justice
Yeah.
is not. We can't do that in a couple minutes. But I would say there are a couple ways of attacking that thought.
Yeah.
Think about in John 9 when the man was born blind, and his disciples came up to him and go, "Oh, wow,
Who sinned?"
Yeah, like who sinned? This guy or his parents, right?
Right.
The question wasn't, did someone sin?
No.
The question was, okay, who's to blame here? Who's
Yeah.
responsible? And he said, nobody.
Right.
Right. That was his response, and that was about a physical issue.
Yep.
The way that mental health issues may have been understood in that time
Right.
is very different than the way that they might be understood now, in the same way that a lot of health issues are. And so again, I'm not discounting a spiritual reality. I'm not discounting a spiritual plane.
Right.
But I think what that question kind of gets to is like, well, who's to blame here? And
Right.
how do we think about it from a sin and blame standpoint?
Right.
And that's exactly what has become problematic in the church, is that it's framed in a way that just heaps on guilt and shame and burden on someone that needs the opposite.
Right.
There's more to say.
Yeah, we'll wrestle this one probably a few times. This is
Yeah, I love
'cause
it.
This is the why we wanted to talk about it, though. This is that question.
Exactly, yeah.
It speaks to it is, the skepticism is that the Bible doesn't speak to psychology. Actually, it speaks to the mind and the renewing of the mind, which is, I would argue, psychology.
Right.
Romans 12, and the conflict of wrestling with our sinful self and trying to, I think all of that has a psychological component
Right.
to it.
And to say that, well, therapy's not in the Bible, well, it's not. But neither is dialysis.
Right.
And neither is eye surgery, and neither,
Right,
And
yeah.
I mean, it's okay that things
Are not in there.
have evolved that are not in there. It doesn't mean it's incompatible with that.
But I would say seeking wise counsel is in the Bible.
For sure.
And we are invited to that. And yeah, there were times when Jesus cast out demons, and there was also times when he just spoke to people who were in situations of struggle.
Right, and the gold standard for most forms of therapy is called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's got the best research, and it's all about the renewing of your mind.
Yep.
It's all about the way that you think and the patterns that you think.
Right.
It is not pulled from Scripture, the protocols and the ways of, but it is very, very consistent and compatible with it. And so that's what we're saying.
Right. And we get caught, and the Bible speaks to this. We get caught in sins, and as we get caught in them, we oftentimes can't break free of them, and that freedom can be helped through some psychology as well as some spiritual disciplines. So, well, all of this is at play, and that's the integration of these two things. So, with that, wow, thank you. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you coming. Oh, you have a fan.
My one fan.
Watch it. She's about to throw her glasses
We wanna
at
do
you.
a survey?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Will you introduce the survey,
Yeah,
please?
yeah. So if you go to the slide that has the QR code, so here's what Journey is doing to demonstrate their commitment to this. Is we've come up with a survey that is anonymous. On these surveys, sometimes you can have it where it captures your URL or your email. This is not. This does not do that. It's stripped of all that stuff. And it is a survey of physical and emotional and spiritual health that we're going to take the information, not from individual responses, but all of it together. We will use it for the podcast. We will use it for the pastoral staff.
Yeah, it'll
and
inform also some of the teaching.
Right.
We will use it to inform us
so
as to how to proceed.
don't be afraid of it. You don't need to do it, but I would love for you to do it. Scan the word is scan, not click, by the way, Ellen. Scan the QR code.
Oh.
And you'll get opportunity
How long
to
does it
do
take? It took about 10 minutes?
It'll take under 10 minutes
Yeah.
to do. So anyone who's teenage years and older, please consider it. We'd love for you to do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, now you know why we did all the music up front. We didn't know how to bring this to a close. I still don't. But if you would stand, I just want to pray over you. I want to pray for your well-being and send you on your way to further this discussion. Jesus, thank you that you give us so many tools, but you give us wisdom, you give us knowledge, you give us an unbelievable amount of information. And Lord, I pray that as we sit in this and we think about this, that truth is truth, that you invite us into a clear mind, you invite us into a relationship. There's so much to say, but yet you are working in each of us in different ways, and we just want to find that way. And may you bless each of these people as they leave this place, and may the conversation continue. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.